All right. Welcome. Today is Tuesday, March 16th, 2021. We are pleased to be presenting Groundswell's Educator Workshop, An Indigenous Way of Being. We are excited to have this content here for you today. We are excited to see many new faces tonight, so welcome if this is your first Groundswell event. This meeting is being recorded and it will be shared on the Groundswell, Michigan YouTube page. I'm going to send you the link right now if you would like to have a link to the YouTube page. There we go. And reminder to mute your microphone, relax and get comfortable. Feel free to even during the presentation. We do suggest that you use a speaker view so that you can see not only the screen being shared with you, but also the presenter. If you are experiencing lagging or skipping, you may want to either take the video off or you can watch the video on your computer and dial in simultaneously to listen. So there are always options if the computer is sluggish. There will be a dedicated Q&A session at the end. So please use the chat function to ask your questions to our presenters, and we will make sure that we collect them and ask them at the end. I'm sure there are plenty. We also got some questions through the registration. So we are excited to ask those questions after we hear our presenters. Our presentation will go from Andrea Riley-Mukavetz. She's the and professor. And that presentation will start about 7:30 and will be the first presentation is Andrea Riley-Mukavetz. She's an assistant administrator at the Intercultural Studies Department at University. She also worked for the Intercultural Studies Program. She worked on communication, which is research, cultural contents, and design. She has applied to research, research. Her book, Go Scenario, I Love Life, is from her book, Agency, Quest, Volume 1, and her life was in the Cabinet Matter. She's in the Shop Flames First Nation Band. She was in the Band of She loves the garden, Ville, Michigan, and Lean Island Forest. So we love to give Andrea a very warm round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just sharing my screen. That way we can see the PowerPoint that I made. Okay. Again, a little bit. I'm just waiting for it. There we go. Okay, let's get started. Ani, Andrea Riley-Mukavetz, class session, CD, Anishinaabe, Genia, Nodam, Rapids, and Dojaba, Muncie, Ontario, Nodonjaba, Metro Detroit, Nodonjaba. I want to begin by thanking you all for coming today and acknowledging the Indigenous people of this land, the three fires, the Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe, the Adawa, and the Potawatomi. What I do well is due to the sacrifices and hard decisions of my ancestors, and what I do poorly is mine and mine alone. And I come to you with a good heart. The title of my presentation today is Taking a Teaching, Storing the Land as Indigenous Pedagogy. So in all of my classes, I have a set of core beliefs about myself as an educator, and a lot of these I'll talk about today. Classrooms should be consensual. Students should have input and say on their learning. They have a right to their own language, and I do not expect them to code switch or leave their language at home, but I'm there to aid them as they mesh their languages together. I create learning experiences that value exploratory learning, that invite students to be critically reflective, learn from their mistakes and failures, and offer opportunities for revision and revision. Where these are not all distinctly Anishinaabe, I think it's important to begin by opening about myself as an educator and what I value. In Land as Pedagogy, Leanne Simpson writes that Aki, the land, is our greatest teacher. Beginning with a story about equations, which translates to little girl, she learns about maple sugaring. And Simpson guides the reader through an Anishinaabe approach to education. For me, by beginning with understanding the land as our greatest teacher and using that as a framework for education, encourages a paradigm shift in our educational system. Through the land, we come to know in a non-hierarchical way, where knowledge comes to us when we are ready, where humans are not at the center of any relationship, but we are just a part of those relationships in an interconnected and constellated way. And so Simpson, she prompts me to ask questions like, how do we learn to listen to the land? What teachings does the land offer? And what happens to our pedagogical practices when we shift from a teacher-student model to a knowledge-sharing model? And that's some of the things I'm going to talk about today. This is a story to honor my teachers. My own research journey began when I was invited to listen, record, and publish the stories of Indigenous women, specifically from Little Traverse Bay Band and Burt Lake. I spent 4 years engaging in oral history work, listening to the stories of their lived experiences, and feeling deep inside the theories that came with them. It wasn't difficult to hear their stories as teachings for how to navigate higher education, but it was difficult to figure out how to translate this deep ancestral, relational, and embodied experience into a dissertation and use it to say things about theory, writing, education, colonialism, and methodologies to my home disciplines of American Indian studies and rhetoric and writing. Early in the process of writing, I struggled. I told kitchen table stories, or when I wrote in an academic voice, it was very defensive, or as I like to say, burned down decades of harmful scholarship. My mentor, Malia Powell, invited me to her kitchen table to talk more about this. But before we got there, she took me to her bed of sweetgrass. Her husband, Michael, was already raking the sweetgrass, brushing her hair, and getting it ready for us. Malia told me the story of the sweetgrass bed. As we kneeled together with scissors and gardening gloves, I couldn't help but speak sweetly to grandmother's hair, saying miigwech and prayers and promising to do well with what I harvest. We brought our harvest to her kitchen table. We braided the sweetgrass together. My notebook and pen were not used for our discussion about dissertations and genres. And this made me anxious because it felt like an academic conversation, an educational space, and also supportive, familial, and relational. Overly focused and trying to get everything perfect, I became frustrated while braiding. There were too many strands in my hands and I couldn't figure out how to hold them all. Malia had me watch her again and again, telling me how long it took her how to learn to get it just right. The braids we made together were all different sizes, thick, thin, only a few were straight. After she chuckled, "Okay, now I know how to help you with your dissertation," she says. At the time, I didn't know what she meant except that I felt flushed from her observation. Now, after so many similar experiences with students, I deeply identify with those dear ones. The crushing perfectionist, the overly shy one eager to please, the angry one who failed at assimilation and spent decades being told their knowledge, their language wouldn't lead to a successful career. I have so many of these experiences sitting with aunties while doing quill work, beadwork, or sewing, hanging with relatives in the wood. And from them, I've learned I know how to teach you because I have seen myself in you. I know how to teach you because I have watched you struggle. I know how to teach you because I have committed myself to a similar practice and can share my own realizations. Oh, crap. I don't know all there is to teach you, but I am committed to walking alongside you. And so these are images of me doing different kinds of making practices with some of my community. So here are some sweetgrass teachings. My understanding of Indigenous pedagogy can be further illustrated through Robin Kimmerer's observation on sweetgrass. It can be braided alone, but it's sweetest together, Kimmerer says. Will you hold the end of the bundle while I braid, hands joined by grass? Can we bend our heads together and make a braid to honor the earth? And then I'll hold it for you while you braid too. Our classrooms are kitchen tables, garden spaces, sewing stations, garages, forests, and riverways. We are huddled over a project together. We remind each other to take breaks, eat something, drink some water. We are all learning and teaching. Like grandmother's hair, the stories of failures and the ecstasy of success is wrapped in. These are the teachings from Malia's kitchen table. Acknowledge and examine the discomfort that comes with the paradigm shift of Indigenous paradigms and intellect. Understand that this discomfort is deeply embodied and reflective of our experiences with colonial impact. Education is a relational, participatory, exploratory process. To teach, we must form meaningful relationships with students. Nurture learners as they dwell in this discomfort. Share your experiences of education, failure, and success. I am sincere when I acknowledge the hilarity or the irony of doing Indigenous work in an institution of higher education. It's exhausting. Work that requires a lot of labor and requesting ongoing support. I alone cannot and should not do it. I am not a master of Anishinaabe knowledge. I am a learner of it and must seek out elders, knowledge keepers, and request their input. I must take them seriously when they raise questions or offer redirection. This itself is already a different model of administration and curriculum development. Through the beliefs and intentions for creation, institutions are colonial spaces. There is a relationship between academia and the imperialistic practices used to erase Indigenous people from this world. Our educational system is designed from the same practices and belief systems as the American Indian boarding schools that tortured Indigenous children and created intergenerational trauma. That system, rooted in Christian missionary practices, approaches teaching through authority. To provide a lesson is to use one's knowledge as power and authority over another. To practice Indigenous pedagogy, to engage in this paradigm shift, is to delink from the colonial knowledge-making practices. It's to address that the larger system needs to be remade. To remake these systems, we must do so through Indigenous governance systems, which I hope and I think that Hunter will talk about later, or we can discuss together through Q&A. Where land-based education is all well and good, without centering Indigenous voices and addressing settler colonialism, it furthers Indigenous erasure. And so I offer some guided questions that I continue to think about as I hold a deliberate position as being both the arms of an institution and practicing decolonial and Indigenous education. What does it look like to create a classroom where the students teach, learn, and provide input? What beliefs around education contradict these philosophies? What does the assignments and evaluation criteria look like through the sweetest ways when it's done together, or knowledge comes to us when we are ready? This is a story about teaching basket making to teach research methods. I decided to teach my class how to make a Cherokee double woven basket. A group of doctoral students invested in teaching first-year writing and pursuing an academic job. I want them to understand the importance of historical context, space, place, and community knowledge and research methods. I invite my friend Ashley. She's the woman in the top right corner with the blonde hair and the top knot, a Miami scholar, to join me for the basket workshop. This is also hilarious, an Ojibwe in a Miami teaching a Cherokee tradition. But this is what community and nation-to-nation relations looks like in this paracolonial world. Our own kin Cherokee scholars and artists taught us a long time ago. We don't ask the students to harvest the materials with us. For a variety of reasons, it's inappropriate for us to offer students those teachings. We explain this and offer it as an understanding of positionality. There's an important teaching in embracing partial knowledge and boundaries. We accept the gift of learning how to make these baskets and pass them down in this context. We accept the responsibilities that come with knowing what knowledge does not get passed on. We arrive to class with reeds, buckets, hopefully enough scissors, and stories. I bring some food for this class because we're practicing the beliefs around the common pot, another land-based practice. One bowl, many spoons this semester. Resources and knowledge should not be extracted irresponsibly. We begin by talking about the history of the basket, our teachers, our relationships with each other. We tease each other for a bit so that way the students can see our own relationships with each other. We model the baskets and tell the stories of learning to make them for the first time. Then I say, okay, fill your buckets with water and get into groups. The students pause for a moment, realizing that I'm serious. They organize themselves, deciding who will go to what restrooms for water. In the hallway, I hear these very serious scholars giggling to their other professors. Oh, I'm just getting some water to make a basket for Dr. RM's class, I know. Huddled over baskets or buckets, I watch the class share materials. Ashley and I are making our baskets together, walking around, offering assistance. They are taking turns with the scissors or offering to cut reeds for each other. They're telling stories about their families or what they ate the other day or how their classes are going. I hear them. Here, let me show you. It's like this. Watch my hands. Teachings from the basket workshop. This is what the basket workshop teaches students about research methodologies. Gather your materials and know where they come from, whether it's text for your literature review, transcribed data, or a bucket and some reeds. Take your time harvesting them in a good way, whether you are deep in a swamp and snakes are nearby, or it's an oral history project. Don't be afraid to undo it and redo it again, whether it's building the outside of the wall, or when you realize that the first 10 pages of your essay was you just figuring out what you wanted to say. Take your time. You can take the materials home with you. I brought enough for everyone and extra if you want to try it again. Research is about long-term relationships. Know how the land, history, and people impact your knowledge. Remember Grandma Spider, and that the story you are telling about your research subject reflects your positionality, your relationship with space, land, history, and knowledge. Research and writing are not neutral. Be careful what you choose to omit and what you choose to emphasize. This is a story about treaty rights. When I was 10 years old, my dad and uncles took me and my sister fishing. Hiking through the woods in northern Michigan, we come across a state trout farm. The sign clearly says we cannot fish there. From an early age, school systems emphasize the importance of policing and not breaking the law. Concerned, I share this. My dad and his brothers look at each other and chuckle. Dad says, our ancestors fished here first, and that's what we're going to do. At 10, I was taught that these laws were not designed with our cultural practices in mind, and that these beliefs around fishing, hunting, and trapping were from a Western perspective. In my Anishinaabe Lifeways class, we read and discussed Matthew Fletcher's book, The Eagle Returns, The Legal History of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians, to understand hunting and treaty rights. Since I wanted to examine hunting, fishing, and foraging practices, I need to share 19th century texts and contemporary community stories. Our practices have changed for a lot of reasons, including different access to technologies and how the conservation movements use their own beliefs to limit our access to the land. Fletcher shares this important story that he came across in a 19th century text. The Grand Traverse Band people fished the big lakes as well. Massive sturgeon could be caught using canoes and 40-foot long spears far out into Lake Michigan. 12 Indian fishers also used gill nets in the open water, sometimes anchoring them to other canoes and sometimes anchoring them to deep water reefs. This story brings us into our own telling of stories similar to the one I just shared with you all about my dad and uncles. Half the class is Anishinaabe, and most of us have a story traipsing through the woods, trapping, hunting, or fishing. The Anishinaabe students are excited to learn about this deep water fishing because it confirms the intelligence and genius of their ancestors. They share that by learning this knowledge, it helped them understand the stories and teachings their own relatives shared with them. And this is what I'm trying to get to, that teaching land-based practices can be rooted in 19th century texts, in larger historical contexts, because this land continues to tell us a story about settler colonialism and Indigenous intellect. We can't do environmental teaching or land-based practices without telling the history of settler colonialism, without giving students an opportunity to reflect on their own relationship to these laws and belief systems. If not, then we make the land an object, a thing that cannot provide us with that knowledge. Aki, the land, is a historian. This is a story about wanting to go somewhere. It's fall 2014 in Bowling Green, Ohio. I'm teaching a fully online course titled Decolonial Theory and Methodology. In the course proposal and syllabus, I promised an experiential learning component. We would go somewhere. Even though I was a Michigan resident, I wanted to go someplace deeply within Ohio Indigenous history, to engage in a space place that would feel familiar for Ohio residents, where they could reach within their own understandings of Ohio history and grapple and reflect on the role of Indigenous experience in that history. Since a middle school studies class, I always wanted to visit the earthworks. These mounds are sacred sites and reflect Indigenous intellect. Through the mounds, we can have a complicated conversation on the sacred, architectural practices, and star systems. The Newark Earthworks, including the Great Circle, the Octagon Earthworks, which are shown here, and the Wright Earthworks, are designated as a part of the Ohio State Park System. In 1910, the Newark Board of Trade leased the Octagon Earthworks to the Mound Builders Country Club, who built a golf course and country club on the sacred site. In 1997, the Ohio History Connection extended the lease to the golf club until 2078, where the Great Circle is available for everyone to use. The Octagon Earthworks are only available to the public 5 days a year. The Newark Earthworks Center, comprised of Ohio State professors and American Indian activists and artists, continue to work to get this site named as a World Heritage in 2008. From what I understand, this is a slow process, and in 2015, a representative of UNESCO visited the site and met with the World Heritage Steering Committee, and they're still in the process. The country club are extremely influential in Ohio and are actively working to intervene in the efforts designated the Newark Earthworks as a World Heritage Site. I'm riding with 2 students, Soha and Danielle. My own husband, who's also named as Michael, has joined us as well and will be doing most of the driving. It's a 3.5-hour drive from my house in Ypsilanti to the Earthworks. Michael and I pick up Soha and Danielle in Bowling Green, offer them some donuts, apples, and coffee. This is Danielle's and Soha's first semester as PhD students, and since the course is online, we've only seen each other in the same space a few times at professional development activities. Danielle has just moved back to the United States after living and teaching in Indonesia for 5 years. She's the one who's making that face, and she's wearing a jean jacket and a scarf. Soha is an international student from Egypt. She has short hair, dark skin, and she has a notebook in her hand, and she's putting her across her arms right there. And has no family in the area. By how they are teasing each other and talking about their dating experience, they've clearly become close. We spend the time building our relationships. I mentor, advise, and like a good auntie, offer dating advice. I'm anxious to get there and keep looking to my Google Maps to understand where we are. So far, all I see are neighborhoods and parks and the typical strip malls. As Michael makes a sharp right turn into a suburban neighborhood, I see them. I gasp loudly, scaring everyone in the car. As I look to my right are the mounds. I feel myself trail off in conversation. I see golf flags mounted on each mound, the tin cups, the golf carts. To my left are tiny ranches with perfectly landscaped lawns. This is no way to treat a sacred space, an ancestral space. I know that Danielle and Soha are both watching me, witnessing my horror and shock, and I let them. Isn't this the purpose of experiential learning and engagement, no matter how messy, painful, and vulnerable? We get there and meet up with the rest of the students. I immediately am filled with rage. People are treating it like an amusement park, letting their children run up and down the mounds, sitting on them and eating. Everyone seems to be having fun. I pull my class aside and help them understand what's going on. A few feel guilty because they were also playing on the mounds. And I say to them, it's okay, now you know. This is a major teaching in my classroom. When you receive a correction, it's your responsibility to listen and take action. We're encouraged to follow the paved trail. The consortium goes through some of the beliefs around the mounds. Don't walk on them, be respectful. People are uncomfortable as they realize what they've done. I keep looking for more Native people, hoping for their guidance to settle every anxious and angry feeling deep in my body. I walk to a tree and, as I was taught, put tobacco down. I know I am being watched, but these practices are important and model how to be a good relative and visitor. Teachings from the mounds. We are all on settled, stolen, Indigenous land. Act as a good visitor and guest. Land, even the most urban of spaces, hold the sacred. Respect it and come to understand how and why it has been treated this way. We can't learn or teach Indigenous worldviews or practices without respecting the sovereignty of tribal nations. Receiving a correction is an important aspect of Indigenous pedagogy. It's designed for growth, sustained relationships, for continued collaboration. Observation and modeling are important components for teaching and learning. And so now what I'm going to do, which is traditional in Anishinaabe spaces, is to provide a giveaway or an offering. And so I'm going to work through some ideas with you all that we can discuss later about how to incorporate Anishinaabe pedagogies. So the first thing I would say is, do you know whose land you are on? So here we have a map, all in Anishinaabe Moen. And the thing I want to say is that what's really important is that by beginning through explaining space and place, by taking the time to situate yourself historically within the cultures of the tribal nations people that you're on, provides you with a direction and a pathway. And the other thing I would say is that we've been doing this work for a long time, and so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Instead, take the time to recognize who has done this work ahead of time, cite them, honor them, host them. So I can put this link in the chat later, but there's the Confederation of Michigan Tribal Education Directors, and for the past couple of years, they've built a wealth of resources around the social studies Michigan standards. And so I want to talk about some possible activities that you could think about doing with your own students and scaling it in terms of any kinds of within their age group. So this is something that I do with my 5-year-old. We feast.
No, it's Florida. I look outside, Barb, I have the same sunshine.
We feast and we talk about Indigenous foods. And so I have the Braiding Sweetgrass book here, and I have the Sioux Chef's Indigenous Kitchen for like the adults. But I think that there's something beautiful in planting a garden, talking about whitefish, or thinking about the brilliance of cattails as a technology that can be used for a lot of different things. And maybe something that happens is that you have a series of conversations like, how does the land provide us with what we need? What can we do to care for the land? And what technologies do Indigenous people use? And so I say technologies here because so often when talking about Indigenous people, we're either put in the past or, and more so, where our technologies are not addressed. And so cattails, for example, or companion planting are what I would consider to be technologies. This is my 7-year-old daughter's favorite book, We Are Water Protectors. So you can have a discussion around how to care for the land and water. And so I'm here talking about harmful representations of Indigenous people. So I'm thinking about you know, when there was a lot of the like 70s, 80s, like earth cleanup, and you could see like the sad Indian and the headdress with like the tear, right? I think doing some media discussions around, you know, how we paint Native people in the past and provide these harmful representations can segue into a discussion around water protecting, for example, talking about toxic capitalism and, you know, how to think about avoiding supporting corporations invested in pipelines and fracking. And asking a series of questions like, how can we treat the water like a precious resource? How do Indigenous communities show love and bravery? What does it mean to stand up for what you believe in? And so the young woman to the bottom left is Autumn Peltier, and she's a teenager who has been doing a series of speeches and advocacy that one can spotlight in their classroom as a model for a young person doing just that. And so finally, what I would like to say is that when thinking about land-based practices through an Anishinaabe perspective, teaching through season, time, and history, focusing and centering Indigenous perspectives, keeping us in the present, connecting us with other communities. So for example, you know, thinking about water protecting or environmental justice or environmental racism, and taking some time to put our experiences in coalition with other underrepresented communities who are also engaging in grassroots movements can further demonstrate our interconnectedness in the land that we're on. And to always make sure to highlight our contributions as Indigenous people into making sure that you're telling also success stories. One of my elders, Susan Applegate Krause, once told me that the best stories are success stories. And so often when we teach Indigenous content, it's taught through the framework of, you know, feeling like feeling bad for us, of pitying us, you know, of telling our stories as if we're gone and wiped away and things like that. So anyway, miigwech, thank you so much for listening. And that's all I got.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I'm sure we could have listened for a lot longer. One moment as I switch over. All right. One more moment here.
I'm at a point where I don't care what they ever just get one, get it. Because they're like, you know me, someone. I mean, everything.
All right.
Older people have these problems. They should be the first people. It's frustrating when they're not. It's exhausting. It's just
Can you hit the mute on for me?
My granddaughter that has rheumatoid arthritis.
There we go. All right. Now to our second presentation of the evening. Hunter Genia is Ojibwa Ottawa Anishinaabe, was born and raised in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where he earned his Master's of Social Work from Grand Valley State University. He has resided in Mount Pleasant for the past 20 years, near his 3 adult sons. Hunter has devoted 30 consecutive years working in Indian country in the social work field, providing Native wellness work on issues and topics such as mental health, community wellness, strategic planning, historical topics, historical trauma, historical resilience work, Native education parity, and much more. Hunter has a passion for training, presenting, and providing workshops on many levels, and one of his highlights was providing testimony to the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs on mental health disparities in Indian country. He is also a proud great-grandson, and sibling of Indian boarding school survivors. He devotes much of his attention to doing his best to uplift tribal communities and being a good ancestor. So I'd like to welcome Hunter to Groundswell.
All right. Ani, Gusan Indigenous, Wabajan Shido Dam, Mount Pleasant, Michigan, Didda, Saginaw, Swan Creek, Black River Band, Ojibwe, Minwa, Grand River Band, Dawa, Anishinaabe, and Dao, Kachima Weshka Bijiyik, Nongo Nakshe. Welcome everybody, and I'm going to disappoint you and not do a PowerPoint. I thought about it, and I would rather just have a discussion and dialogue with all of you. So this is going to be a little bit participatory. And so I'm going to ask you a couple of 2 or 3 questions. The only thing I ask is that you not use your phones or computers to look up the answers. And so if you could, for those of you that are not too shy, go ahead and turn on your webcams. And awesome. See, this is how it works. You get to see my face. I get to see most of yours. So in the chat box, if you could, when we refer to the people of the 3 fires, what 3 predominant tribes are we referring to? Go ahead and type the answer in the chat box. All right. Pretty good. The Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi. All right. So very good, very good. And how many federally recognized tribes do we have in Michigan? Put the number in the chat box. All right. So, yeah, no, I think that's okay. That's all right. That's good. I have to share a little story, and excellent job, Andrea. Really enjoyed your presentation, and so that was awesome. Andrea made me think of an experience that I had in growing up in Grand Rapids. How many of you remember the old Studio 28 theater? Yeah, I do too. I used to go to the movies there all the time. And I remember in 1990, there was a movie that came out. It's called Dances with Wolves. Yes, Dances with Wolves. And I'm pretty sure most of you probably have all seen that. And we had a local Native American drum group, and we actually were asked to sing. I'm not sure if we were asked to sing or we might have just showed up and said, we're going to sing. I'm not really sure. And so after that, it was an interesting experience, because after that movie, we had a lot of people who came out and heard us sing. And then something interesting happened. A lot of people apologized. They apologized for what happened here in America. And I thought that was really interesting. Like, we didn't really know how to respond to that. Like, it was something that never really happened before. And, you know, and I just want to I was writing down some information and I thought I would share some of this with you. There was a certain policy in the federal by the United States government. And if you know the name of this policy, it had to do with the removal of several tribes in the United States. In what year? Does anybody know the name of the act and what year? It's all right. So don't look it up. If you don't know it, we're going to go in the honor system here. So the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and this was under Andrew Jackson. And of course, most of you have read or might have read the Trail of Tears, which had to do with several southeastern United States tribes on a forced march under military by foot over 1,500 miles to the Kansas and Oklahoma territory. Roughly up to 50% of that population perished on that march. Just a few short years ago, I attended a National Indian Youth Leadership Conference in Oklahoma. And this was coordinated by an organization called Unity, United National Indian Tribal Youth. And during that, and there was probably about 1,800 to 2,000 American Indian youth who came to this conference. And I've been a part of this organization for over 30 years. And they have a cultural and talent show night. And the group of youth decided to sing this song. And before they sang the song, they talked about the story and the origin of the song. And they were granted permission to sing this song. But this was the same song that was sung at the Mississippi River before many of the elders who could not cross that river because they weren't physically strong enough. They sang this morning song because they knew that they were going to be leaving them behind and we're not going to be able to make it with the rest of the community and their people. And you can hear a pin drop in that room, you can imagine, a song that has not been sung for over almost 200 years. And that was a morning song that they shared at this youth leadership conference. And so you can imagine how emotional that was. And all three of my sons graduated from the local public schools here. And what's really sad is that I asked them, I'd like to see your history book that they're teaching from today. And I was shocked that this was pretty much the same information that I was taught when I was going through high school about Native American education in our school system, K through 12 in high school. And so, a lot about what I talk about and doing trainings for schools and different organizations, even on the state level, has been around challenging our adult college educated people to get involved in being a part of the change. People have this idea they want to change the world, but they forget to change themselves first. And so changing the world is not going to happen unless we start with ourselves. And so some of the other information I want to give to you just to think about. And the reason why I'm telling you this information is because it's not taught in our high schools and it's not taught in our colleges or universities. And I've been a guest lecturer and speaker at some of the local universities and colleges, so I know firsthand the same questions that I'm asking you are basically the same responses that I'm getting from our college educated individuals. I also had the opportunity in 2021 to meet with a university here in the state of Michigan. I was invited by the college president to have a meeting with them, a virtual Zoom meeting. And I thought, okay, yeah, no problem. I thought there would be 3 or 4 people jumping on. There were 17 administration people from this university, from the athletic director to director of diversity and inclusion, student retention, you name it. So I kind of started out the same way I did. And I asked them, I said, I'm not going to embarrass you, I just want you to idea that you're in a position of power to influence our children and our students who are coming to you to learn something. And I asked all of them, I said, how many of you can any of the federally recognized tribes in the state of Michigan? And not one gave me one name of tribe in Michigan. I'll ask you what's yours. If I ask you to name the 12 federally recognized tribes in Michigan, how many can do that? And yet for myself, my children that go to school, we're asked to name all 50 states in the United States. And yet all of our Michigan students that come out of education cannot name tribes in the state of Michigan. So this is where we have some unbalanced education when it comes to informing our students and providing them about our ancestors. Now, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in Grand Rapids. I graduated from Hills High School in 1987. I played basketball, football, baseball. I grew up with my grandparents. And I'm asking you another question. Were there any more schools in Michigan? Help me know. Okay. Seeing that there's not a whole lot of typing going on, I would say yes. Okay. I'll give you a hint. One of them's in the town that I live in. Where do I live? Mount Pleasant. Okay. Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial Boarding School. All right. How many of you have been to Mount Pleasant? All right. So I'm reminded almost every day about who we are here in America, because just down the road, those buildings are still standing. I told you I grew up with my grandparents. Both of my grandparents attended that boarding school. Now, if you know anything, if you've done any studying about Indian boarding schools, what were some policies that were part of the Indian boarding school experience? Go ahead and type in what you know. Okay, not your language. Not allowed to practice our traditions, our spirituality. Okay, oftentimes having to take an English name. All right. So, and I mentioned that I'm also a sibling to 2 boarding school survivors. And the other boarding school was in northern Michigan in Harbor Springs called Holy Childhood of Jesuits Preschool. That was the Catholic Indian missionary school. That was not federally funded, but was ran by the Catholic diocese. Okay. When I lived in Grand Rapids, I remember around 1990, most of you are familiar with the Grand Rapids Press, how thick that is? Right on the front page, reports of abuse at the Holy Childhood boarding school. What kind of abuse are they talking about? Sexual, physical, emotional, spiritual. Okay. And the Holy Childhood Indian Boarding School remained open until 1983 before it was shut down. Now that community there decided they didn't want those buildings to remain longer, and they made sure that they were taken down. Okay. So generally speaking, the boarding school era was pretty much like around 1890 to 1930s, early 1930s across the United States. But as you can see, some boarding schools remain open a lot longer than that. Okay. By 1890, over 98% of the Native American population was gone. 98%. And a lot of you are like, that doesn't make sense. So only about 2% of our population from first contact with those that came over to these new lands to then remained still alive percentage-wise. So even today, if you think about the United States Indian population, we only make up about 5%. Okay. In 1883, the Religious Science Code Act was an act that basically outlawed the practice of our own religion, our own culture, our own traditions, our own native spirituality. And when you think about that particular act, 1883, it was only 7 years later that they were allowed to use that act to have the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890, where unarmed men, women, elders, and children were killed by the United States cavalry. Okay. What's really weird about that is weird is not an appropriate term, but dramatic about that is the Indian boarding school at Carlisle, mostly the Carlisle Indian School, or if you think of one of the most famous athletes, regardless of where he stood for, who attended that school. While that was happening out west in South Dakota, we had Native children from that same community or communities surrounding that were attending the Indian boarding school in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, not knowing what's happening back in their traditional homelands. By 1887, we had the Dawes Allotment Act, which basically was intentional to break up Native communities and give them their own land. Okay. By 1924, we have the Native U.S. The Cider Act, which finally granted all Native Americans citizenship in the United States. Now, keep in mind, every single war that has been, Native Americans have had highest capital that has served the United States, including World War I, before we were allowed to fully become members of the United States citizens. Okay. But there's other practices that are going on that I want you to dig a little deeper. And I want you to keep in mind, by 1871, the treaty making era with tribes in the United States had ceased. 1871. As I mentioned, by 1890, 98% of our population was gone. But if you look at some of the other policies, it would be understated to say that every 4 years, Native American tribes and Native American people have high anxiety, because we don't know what the next federal Indian policies are going to come out of the United States government. And in the 1950s and 1970s, we have to look this up. There was actually a Bureau of Indian Affairs who awarded contracts to U.S. adoption and U.S. religious adoption agencies that systematically removed Indian children from our native homes. And we think, well, why would this happen? What happens to a tribe if you remove the children? What happens to that tribe's future? You remove the children from that community and from that tribe. It was systematic extermination. So once we got away from extermination by warfare, we had extermination by lawfare. Does that make sense? And what that will allow is, again, the federal policies getting and save the man which was a phrase that was termed by Colonel Richard Pratt, who was the creator, Captain Richard Pratt, who was the creator of the whole Indian boarding school concept. And so a lot of these policies were not, believe it or not, after I was born, were not undone. We had the native sterilization of women without their consent in Indian healthcare systems by non-native physicians. Again, this was under the elder George Bush when he was president under a Family Planning Act. And that's how this was achieved. So again, systematic termination of tribes by law. And I'm sharing this information because many of you are teaching schools in advanced grades, say middle school or high school. This is information that students should know. They can watch radar movies and see all the different TV shows that are going on that highlight crime and murder and all these other kinds of topics that we think are terrible, which they are. Why are we so hesitant to teach American history from the truth? Okay, part of it is just all. The ones who are teaching, I mean this respectfully, is that what you were taught from the same information was said to me. And so a lot of it is just left out of mainstream education. So it really wasn't undone until we had 1975, which finally we had the Indian Child Welfare Act, which highlighted the awareness of the systematic removal of Native children from Native homes, many that were placed far across the United States in non-Native homes, etc. In 1978, we had the American Indian Freedom of Religion Act, which undone finally 100 years later, the Religious Crimes Code Act. So think about it. One of the founding principles of the United States Constitution was freedom of what? Religion. And Native Americans, even though we're in our original homeland, we were not given that same right until 1978 protected. Okay. So, Andrea mentioned, about the land, and, in 2012, the United Nations did a report. The United Nations actually sent over a human rights person as a part of the human rights in 2012 to do a study of U.S. history, particularly around land and land acquisition. And in that report, he estimated that up to 90 million acres should be returned to Native American tribes that were illegally and unlawfully acquisitioned by non-Native Americans. Now, the chances of the United States ever listening to the United Nations on a report like that is I mean, let's be realistic, that's not going to happen. Okay. So as a Native American, as an Anishinaabe, as a parent of 3 sons, what I can tell you is that in a good way that there's nothing that we don't talk about around the kitchen table here. Because I understand that just like for many of you, the information I just gave you is new. Who's going to carry that information forward? Who's responsible for that? And so, I have to make sure that my sons have some of this knowledge and are not afraid to speak up in a good way. And about 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and Lynn was there. We were out at the Dakota Access Pipeline. How many of you know what the Dakota Access Pipeline was about? Why was there a protest there? And the hard thing being Native is that our values just don't quite match up with those that have a lot of the power in the United States that make decisions. The pipelines or the environment, protection of water or contamination of water, clean air versus, I think we're one of the countries that pollutes the air the most in the world, period. So I share this information just in a good way. I want to give you some things to think about. How do we teach, and how do we teach the truth? A week ago, I was talking to a Native American Youth Council from Navajo Prep down in Arizona by Zoom. their teacher, who was a really good friend of mine, asked me to talk about historical trauma and resilience. They were given the assignment to watch the documentary, The Canary Effect, which all of you could actually, you could write that down, The Canary Effect, and watch it on YouTube. It's a 65-minute documentary. And one of the things that the Native youth said, these are coming from high schoolers, is that every high school in America should have to watch that documentary. And I couldn't, I can't disagree with them. There are good ways to teach about uncomfortable truths. And I think that's what we have to become better skilled at. Whether it's in a trauma-informed approach in our school systems or, but there are ways to talk about things that are not comfortable. So I know my time is up, and I hope that you learned at least one good piece of historical information. If not, I hope that there was something thought-provoking that you will take forward and commit yourself to at least implementing some of those changes in your classroom and to your students. And so I just want to appreciate you all. I did mention to Jessica in another meeting before this that these kinds of topics and discussions usually happen over a full 1 or 2 days. So I'm actually hoping to come back in the fall and do some on-site training with Groundswell and really get deeper into these topics on a much more meaningful level. So I hope to see you all in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And to both of you, a moment just to appreciate sharing your stories and all your knowledge with us. And we hope that we have been receptive to that. So thank you. And as we move forward, we would love to go into some of the questions that we've gotten from the chat. And I have Wendy Vogel helping me. So Wendy, you are welcome to start reading some of the questions, and then I will also pull in a few questions that I received from registration as well. So feel free to get started.
Yeah, sure. So we had some responses to the first question, which is local context sources to gain better understanding of the pre-development history of specific parcels of land in the Grand Rapids area. There were some responses in the chat, and we just wondered if there were any others that the two of our speakers might recommend to become more informed. The answers were, here, let me post the responses so that you have both of those so you know where that comes in. These were our responses.
If I may, I'd like to put that in context. It would probably help everyone.
Thanks, Mark.
So Mark Fitzpatrick here. There's two contexts going on, and they're both about parcels on rivers. One's on the Grand River, one on the Thorn Apple River, near where they merge. Part of the greater Grand Rapids history, part of the civilizations that lived here for thousands of years. We know that knowledge. And at one location, we're doing interpretive panels at a location to tell people the history of the land. And the history of the land talks about current purchaser of the land, the last farm that was there, the Europeans that settled that. And then this story goes, and then this was Native American land before that. I'm trying to fill in that gap and tell that story. The other is that we're applying for a grant to further develop a park area on one of the properties, and there's a federal national park guideline, SHPO is the abbreviation, that requires history. And so we've done documentation of the development of that property for the last 100 years, and it shows no other archaeological research or other documentation. And so to complete that history in federal, national parks, state, and historic marker knowledge, really wanted to have a better documentation of what's the history of that, even though there was never, quote unquote, an archaeological dig. We know there's a history. And so I'm just digging to get some of that that's beyond a generic, oh, this was Native American land before it was settled, you know. And so those are the contexts. And it is really getting into trying to tell the story that's not in our current history.
Hi, this is Andrea. I'm awkwardly putting things in the chat, and I have this like little beach ball that's like slowing down. So, you know, I talked about 19th century texts. And so like what I would do is read those. So like Andrew Blackbird, George Copway, William Warren are all really great examples of 19th century Anishinaabe intellectuals writing about what it was like during that time period and recalling the land before settler colonialism. And, you know, what I would say is you might look through those, and also as you read them, there's an important historical context that goes with them, where they were writing from the perspective of Christianized Native people. And so they were trying to make particular kinds of arguments for their survival and for their community survival at the same time. So as you read them, it might seem a little weird, the kinds of like arguments they might take up, but these, and I'm going to put a few more in the chat, will have some good starting point information that you can like track down, and they're easily accessible and things like that. Hunter, did you want to add anything?
No, not really. He
Right,
did a
thanks,
great job.
Andrew.
So, and that honestly, if he takes the time to read that, I think that would be a great start, you know, because honestly, I mean, a lot of people just don't take the time to read, and you know, we leave it to others to be the experts. And you know, I can just tell you through other efforts that I'm working on a federal level, it's really sad how we think that we don't have the ability to teach those that are in power. And you know, so I do what Andrea says, Mark, and you'll be in good shape as a start. But I would also say is to follow up with, you know, Lynn and Andrea, and you can get our contact information through Jessica, and we can also give you additional resources to you know, help you make some connection and contacts.
Thanks, Hunter.
Yep.
All right. So the other question, oh, Andrea, we would like to know the name of the new book, because there's a lot of people who know how do we get our hands on that.
Well, there's no idea number yet. So you just edit. So, so now, but I tell you, I can write the name and better. So as Hunter was talking about boarding school, so this is an oral history. It's an oral history project I'm working on for about 10 years with an Azala elder from Little Traverse Bay Band. And she's a boarding school survivor. She attended a boarding school, and then she was a maid and moved to Lansing. And she started a Native American recovery group. She was a substance abuse. Thank you, Jessica. She started a substance abuse recovery program for Native Americans at Cristo Bay in Lansing, Michigan. So it details her lived experiences. And my introduction for the academics out there provides like methodology around land-based practices and multi-generational storytelling. So,
All right.
yes, it'll come soon.
Well, I will write our as you field, and then we know we will send it to. All right. So questions more. I think we have some of the answers to the what authors maybe have written within historical truths. If you might have researched at top. If there's maybe some layering or questions about how we teach the truths we don't know, that was a question. It's a good question. So how we go about getting to be.
Well, I think that, you know, I talked a lot about identifying oneself as a learner. So again, like this is this educational perspective, right? This Western framework is there's this expectation that educators have mastery knowledge, and we know that's not true, right? And so the idea of I'm entering the class as a learner, and I say what I know, what I want to learn. And if I don't know something, which is very often, I do the practice research and I'm students among that. Let's look together. Let's ask somebody. And I think that's a really important thing, especially if we're trying to do the inquiry. And also, there's part of the other question I saw about like how you do this like sad story thing, also have empowerment. One thing that's connected to this is that sometimes we have to embrace this. We have to understand the sad stories, right? Like they're sad stories, but I just that day that they're horrifying stories. The stories that should make us angry. And so instead of making it about sadness, right, we can hold it as grief. We also empower students to think about action.
Yeah, and I would add to that, in my other job, I work with tribes across the United States addressing suicide prevention, mental health promotion, and substance misuse with SAMHSA grants that have a lot of those kinds of grants. And so the organization I work for is out of Washington, D.C. area. And so, and we're doing a lot of trauma-informed engagement and, with a lot of our tribal communities that because of a lot of the intergenerational trauma. I just saw a thing yesterday where with the COVID, the highest population that is dying from that is our Native American population. But that's been true of every pandemic that has happened in the history of the United States. And a lot of it has to do with our socioeconomic status, access to resources. If you look in Indian country, the 10 largest Native American reservations have upwards of 40 to 60% average unemployment. Of those, there's severe unemployment at a very high level that is greater than the federal poverty line that's established. Now, most people don't know this, right? I mean, think about this. How many Native American actors, how many Native American shows, how many Native American news stations do you watch in any given day of the week? I mean, so when you think about our population, oftentimes this is what the youth are saying is that we feel very invisible in our own land, in our own country, right? And so how do we build resilience and build capacity within our tribes? And these are that we really need in 2021. If you were to visit some areas in the United States and health facilities, some are in third world conditions. Some still don't have access to water, electricity, broadband, and we're just expecting everyone to be okay. We're going to get through this. We have no idea telling their story in 2021. So that's kind of the feeling. That's how a lot of people are feeling. We have to have historical resilience as much as we do some of the unfortunate stuff. And so, trauma-informed classrooms is about providing safety. It's about allowing dialogue and conversation to happen, but with safety and supports in place, because there can be a lot of triggers that could happen. And so I know that there are, for instance, Project Aware, which is a SAMHSA grant. It's a mental health grant, a 5-year grant, and they have tribes that have European education schools, have trauma-informed schools now. And so they're allowing for cultural practices, our own language, those spiritual and cultural supports, so that our tribal students feel safe and our who we are is embraced, in the classroom. So there are different trauma forms, models, but so they do exist. It might sound new, but it's been around for a while.
Okay. Let's see. How do you teach status, music empowered and hopeful?
I think Andrea might have addressed that a little bit.
I think she
already.
did.
Too. I think one thing that I want to make sure that we touch back on, and because it came up in our conversation a little bit, was the idea of how teachers can become allies to and reach out to their students so that they feel like they have the ability to express their individuality as Indigenous. So what are some of the tools that are in the teacher toolbox is to use to open up these dialogues for their students? I think telling the stories is one of the things you've already mentioned, being aware of, not being afraid to tell real history. But I think some teachers also are very scared of presenting things in the wrong light as well. So they want to make sure that they're being an ally in the right ways. So could you speak a little bit to just as how teachers can be allies to not only, hear the real histories and keep speaking up and making sure they feel empowered to do that and speaking up when they get those opportunities?
Andrea, you want to take it since you're a teacher?
Yeah, I just was waiting for your cue, Hunter. I think I'm having a variety of different thoughts. So I think that Hunter has touched on, you all are not like taught this history, right? And so there comes this anxiety of doing it in the right way. And so like I would want to re-emphasize taking time to learn and before people are doing the work. So like I'm gonna put this link in the chat. So sorry, I think that when you have a so I think I often sit at the table at a time with them, and we're all the leaders together and have people learn components of big apart from that together. And the thing that became clear was that there was a lot of effort put into those kinds of guides, and so I think that you can find them and understand that there already are these materials out there to them. And my thought is, you know, story was they just help them bring. So begin by saying I'm going to do a second on bring schools. Right? Do what I'm doing and see how it goes. The suggestion I would get any kind of video, right? You practice one thing, you're gonna mess up, you're gonna mess up, right? You know this, you know, then you're gonna mess up. And then this and something, right? And so taking philosophy around us as educators and learners, you know, and I think also modeling that language that it's okay to learn hard things. Like so often we're afraid to have difficult conversations, especially with people because parents or you know expectations around representation. And I think that sometimes you have to be people who think a little bit, and so you have to get in trouble, or you have to say I didn't know anything. And I think that's another way to model, you know, that you're gonna make mistakes, you know, you piss somebody off, just a hard situation, right? And then forward modeling that and continue. That's my honest answer. I hope it's okay.
Wanda, I see you. Good trouble. I know who you're talking about. That's right. We all need to be good trouble. You know, I'm just going to share real quickly. And when I was 8 years old, many winters ago, my mom with some family friends drove us out to Washington, D.C. And so I was attending what was called the longest walk, and it was about people fighting for just rights and treaty rights here in America. And that was my first experience in Washington, D.C. But you know, one of the things I noticed when I went to schools is how they teach our history until 1900, and then there was like no more history after 1900. It's like, wait a minute, we're still here. What's going on? You know, and most of the information that I gave you was post 1900. If you didn't notice, you know, so there is so much that's happened. You know, from my grandpa's time through current. You know, we just had Deb Holland, who was confirmed to lead the Interior Department of you know, DIA and the federal government. But I kind of like she's got a lot of pressure on her shoulders from a lot of Native Indigenous peoples because my tribe included, we were federally terminated, even though we signed over 15 federal treaties with the United States government. And then they gave a reservation away to another tribe and created a new tribe. And there's stories like that never seen all over the country. Although there's stories you don't know because, again, you know, not the dead horse, but they're just not taught. So now going back to Washington, the direct and justice has been done not only to us, but hundreds of tribes across the United States. And you know, so Helen has a lot of pressure on her because she doesn't have the authority to correct it herself. However, you know, she's going to be watched by Congress if she doesn't toe the line on some things, even though the Department of Justice has already given an opinion that she has the authority to correct bad acts by the United States government. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 4 years. You know, so everything, you know, the biggest thing I want to say is everything that's happened in history has everything to do with who we are and what's going on today for our people. And it's because of the battles that we have in federal courts, to treaty rights, to fishing rights, to hunting rights, to reservation boundary rights in cases. The crimes that happen on reservations has everything to do with past case law that's happened in the United States. And so whenever people start having courts, you know, these attorneys that bring those cases, everything that's happened in history, bring them right back through because there's case law precedents that's already happened. But the problem is the rest of America doesn't know any of it. So, you know, it's to suggest that the swamp has been drained would be farthest from the truth. And I don't know if it'll ever happen as long as money is buying power. And it's a mountain to climb. And I know because I've been in DC meeting with the Interior, and it reminds us of who we are today and our place in America today as a Native American. It didn't stop in 1800s. It's happening in 2021. So I'll leave you with that good message.
Yeah. Thank you. Wise professor, I was just thinking, said to our class once, the system is perfectly set up to get the results we're getting right now. So in order to change the results we're getting, somehow we got to change the system. So it's such wonderful things to talk about and things that you shared with us. So thank you again to our presenters, Hunter, Andrea. I also want to thank Lynn Bardwell for helping organize from Grand Valley's Office of Multicultural Affairs. And thank you to all of you for joining us. I am putting...
Hey, Jessica, you went on mute.
I put a link in the chat, thank you. I put a link in the chat for the sketch forms if you would like to do that. And we will follow up with some of the links and resources you heard tonight and the recording as well.
Hey, thank all of you for
again.
coming. So we appreciate you committing to the time to be here. Thank you.
And the word was miigwech. Thank you.
Miigwech. Miigwech. Nahaudash. Pamapi kowamin.
Pamapi.
I'll see you in the fall, maybe.
We're inviting you all back.
Oh
Please
yeah, love
join
it.
us.
Love to.
Good night, everybody. Thank you so much. Feel free to take yourself on mute and off mute. And
You need me to stay on for anything, or are we?
I think we are good. You've had a long day, and I appreciate your time and energy putting this presentation together. So I look forward to speaking with you again very soon.
Awesome. Take care, Jessica. Thank you. And Wendy, thank you.
Nice to meet you. Thank you so much.
Okay. And Mark, follow up with us. We'll get you some more contacts.
Thanks, Hunter. It's great. We'll be able to work through that. A lot of good things. Thanks, Jessica, and your Groundswell team for putting this together.
You're welcome. Our pleasure.
See y'all.
Bye.
Jessica, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.